I call the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The plebiscite motion before the House is an embarrassing leftover from the Leader of the Opposition's attempt to have a vote that even he said he wouldn't abide by. But having told this parliament that a plebiscite was going to be brought before it, the Leader of the Opposition has to follow through. But it's difficult to know what the Leader of the Opposition expects to make of this. As with his say one thing to one audience and another thing to another audience approach, the Leader of the Opposition has, on this issue, said that on some days he would abide by the results of a plebiscite, on other days he wouldn't abide by the results of a plebiscite. But, Deputy Speaker, I think ordinary Australians see this for the stunt that it is. They recognise that what faces Australia now are two very different plans. The major political parties in Australia are committed to the same targets. Both sides of the House are committed to a 5% emissions reduction target by 2020. That 5% number sounds fairly small, but it's important to remember that's against a business as usual case in which emissions rise substantially and in a context in which the Australian economy grows substantially. If you think of total carbon emissions per dollar of GDP, the 5% emissions reduction target is actually a halving of the carbon intensity in the Australian economy. So that is, Deputy Speaker, a target worth fighting for. It is going to make a real difference to the environment, and I am pleased that, at least for now, the opposition are in the tent on that particular policy. The trouble is, Deputy Speaker, they are in the tent in the most inefficient way. While the government is looking at the high-speed rail solution, the coalition are standing by the side of the road, seeing if they can thumb a ride from anyone going by because their battered-down jalopy is broken down. The government's strategy goes directly to the problem. It goes directly to the fact that dangerous carbon pollution is causing world temperatures to warm. We've seen that steady warming. There's a vast consensus from scientists that the world is warming and that humans are causing that warming. We know, for example, that in Australia, since World War II, each successive decade has been warmer than the one that preceded it. We know that sea level rises have occurred. We know that temperature rises have occurred. And we know that the pattern of temperature changes is consistent with human-induced warming. If you look at the different levels of the atmosphere in which the warming has taken place, it is entirely consistent with what anthropogenic climate change models would predict. So that means, Deputy Speaker, we need to go directly to the heart of the problem, and the government is doing that by pricing carbon pollution. By putting a price on carbon pollution, we induce innovation in the market. We encourage entrepreneurs, small business people, large business people to make the decisions that will ensure that we, as a community, reduce dangerous carbon pollution to the greatest extent possible. But by contrast, the Coalition has a Subsidies for Polluters plan. While Labor will put in place a price on pollution and provide generous assistance to households, businesses and investment in renewables, the Coalition will slug Australian households. We used to think that slug would be $720 a year until the Coalition said that they wouldn't internationally link those schemes. Where the trend throughout the world has been international linkage of carbon pricing schemes, the Coalition now has a go-it-alone approach. And that, of course, pushes up the cost to households. Our estimates now is that the cost of the Coalition Subsidies for Polluters scheme is now $1,300 on each Australian household. That's a substantial slug, and of course what you get for that is a much less efficient scheme. At the same time, the Coalition are committed to axing the very public servants who would need to administer their scheme. There are many virtues to a market-based scheme, Deputy Speaker. One of them is that individuals put in place all of the change that you expect. We encourage polluters to put in place abatement technologies to use their fuel more effectively. We encourage households to choose the lower carbon alternative product when they look at it on the shelf. But the Coalition's direct action program, far from allowing them to scrap the Department of Climate Change, as they have claimed, would most likely require more public servants to administer it, would most likely require an increase in personnel because, of course, if you're going to put in place a scheme which is straight out of central planning, you need more people to do that central planning. And we've seen throughout this process the Prime Minister being willing to face the hard questions. The Prime Minister constantly has been willing to go out, speak to people in shopping centres, engage with people at community meetings, engage with a wide cross-section of Australians. But the Leader of the Opposition has constantly been running away. He's only willing to speak to hand-picked audiences. He's only willing to speak to the party faithful. A couple of weekends ago at a West Australian Liberal Party conference, which voted for a royal commission into climate science, a great embarrassment on the Liberal Party if ever there was one. One assumes the next Western Australian Liberal Party motion will be a royal commission into the notion that Elvis is alive and well and living in Subiaco, or maybe a royal commission to whether the moon landing was faked. After walking out of that Western Australian Liberal Party conference, the Leader of the Opposition literally ran away from journalists. They asked him so many hard questions and his car wasn't there to pick him up. He had to run around the corner. But of course, when he arrives here in Canberra, we see much the same. And so the Leader of the Opposition made his way up to Dixon, my local shopping centre, a place where I was on the weekend holding a mobile office, and sought to hold a media stunt, as he often does, at a local butcher. The only slight snag that he ran into, Deputy Speaker, was that the butcher wouldn't have a cut of it. The butcher wouldn't let the Leader of the Opposition through the door, and so the Leader of the Opposition was left driving down to the other end of Canberra, down to Fyshwick, to find another butcher who would let him in. The matter, not surprisingly, then arose in the subsequent media conference on the 17th of August that the Leader of the Opposition put in place. Questions were put to the Leader of the Opposition, such as, did your office try to persuade the owners to let you come in this morning? Again, I'm not going to go to the ins and outs, the Leader of the Opposition said. So they didn't refuse to let you in, but the point I make at times is, journalist comes back, but on the subject though, you refused entry to the shop. You refused entry to the shop by the staff there. Leader of the Opposition, I can understand why the Australian people feel deeply ripped off. And finally at that point, one of the journalists says, but you're not answering the question, Mr Abbott. And that is, of course, symptomatic of the Leader of the Opposition's approach. As Twitter later noted, so much for stakeholders. Will Mr Abbott again appear on Meet the Press? And as another wag noted, perhaps some of his schedulers might be in for the chop. But while there's much amusement to be had from the Leader of the Opposition's flips and backflips, we are dealing here with very serious issues. And it is those serious issues that concern the House, and I think concern those of us who are serious about long-term economic reform, when we see the sort of scare campaign that the Leader of the Opposition is running. On a current affair on the 1st of December 2009, the Leader of the Opposition said, this will be a truth campaign, not a scare campaign. But, alas, Deputy Speaker, we've seen anything but. In a doorstop on the 12th of July, the Leader of the Opposition said the whole purpose of the carbon tax is to phase out the coal industry. Of course, not true at all, Deputy Speaker. We know that trade-exposed emissions-intensive industries will have generous assistance available to them. We know that the permits that will be provided there will be provided for good reasons. Labor has always been the party that has stood up for Australian jobs, and Labor recognises that because climate change is a global problem, we don't solve anything by exporting pollution overseas. If an emitter simply moves to another country, then that doesn't do any good for climate change. So we want to ensure that emissions don't move overseas, but we don't want to blunt the effect of the carbon price. And providing free permits does just that. The price effect is still there, but by providing the free permits, we ensure that jobs are maintained. The Leader of the Opposition has said in Peabody Metropolitan Mine on the 9th of June 2011, the problem is that this mine will be one of many mines under threat if Julia Gillard's carbon tax goes ahead. Later that doorstop, Leader of the Opposition said a carbon tax ultimately means death to the coal industry, and that's very, very bad news for the Illawarra, bad news for the mine and everybody who works here. And this constant scare campaign would be one thing if it was just directed to people in this place. But Australians are busy people. They often only have a chance to get small snippets of the news, maybe a few grabs here and there. And so it's not surprising that having run a vigorous scare campaign over the past couple of years, Mr Abbott has succeeded in scaring some Australians. And we've seen the effect of that in some of the trucks that have arrived snarling up the traffic in my electorate this morning. But just because you run a scare campaign, Deputy Speaker, doesn't mean you've got your facts right. Mr Abbott has said that as a result of the carbon price, Whyalla will be wiped off the map. He said that in a doorstop on the 27th of April 2011. But that's not the view of the steel companies. One Steel is completing a $65 million upgrade of its Whyalla blast furnace to extend its working life beyond 2020. BlueScope has described the carbon price as a pragmatic solution to a complex problem. We have many respected voices in the industry who have recognised the importance of putting a price on carbon pollution. The value of using a market-based mechanism is if you start early, then you are able to achieve least cost abatement. Like many things in life, as the Prime Minister has noted, they don't get cheaper by putting them off. Of course, the Leader of the Opposition has had a multiplicity of positions on carbon pricing. In 19th of July 2011, he said, I've never been in favour of a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. But of course, that stands in stark contrast with his interview on Sky News, when he said on the 29th of July 2009, I also think that if you want to put a price on carbon, why not just do it with a simple tax? Then he supported the emissions trading scheme, 27th of November 2009, 2UE. You can't have a climate change policy without supporting this ETS at this time. 2nd of October 2009, Lateline, we don't want to play games with the planet. So we are taking this issue seriously, and we would like to see an ETS. As the member for Wentworth has noted on his blog on the 7th of December 2009, his only redeeming feature in this remarkable lack of conviction is that every time he announced a new position to me, he would preface it with, mate, I know I'm a bit of a weather vane on this, but... And having this multiplicity of positions really means that Australians are increasingly realising that the Leader of the Opposition will say anything to any audience. That stands in stark contrast to the leaders that have come before him. There are many things on which I would disagree with former Prime Minister John Howard, but he did take seriously the challenge of carbon pollution. He commissioned work done on climate change and the use of market-based mechanisms in the late 1990s. Former Prime Minister John Howard went to the 2007 election promising to implement an emissions trading scheme. Member for Wentworth, as Leader of the Opposition, continued that tradition. Why? Because sensible Conservatives around the world recognise that market-based solutions to environmental problems are in the great tradition of small L liberalism. And as a result, Deputy Speaker, we on this side of the House are now the heirs to the Deakin legacy. We're the heirs to the legacy of ongoing reform. We stand for economic reform for the long game, for focusing on solutions that will build a better Australia. The modern Liberal Party have simply turned into the party of no. They hate us. They hate us on every issue, and you can see that hate is palpable when they hold their community meetings. But ultimately, they need us. The modern Liberal parties are no longer, Liberal and National parties, are no longer parties of ideologies, of belief, as they once were. They are now anti-Labor parties. They are now anti-reform parties. They need us because without us they stand for nothing. The definition of the modern Liberal and National Party platform these days is whatever the Labor Party is for, we're against it. They are the party of opposition, the party of denial, the party of negativity, the party of no. There's of course another party like that in world politics that we can see, and that's the Tea Party. We've seen Senator Bernardi indeed calling for an Australian Tea Party. Senator Bernardi would like to see the Tea Party imported into Australia. But we don't need a modern Tea Party, Deputy Speaker, because we've got the Liberal and National parties, willing to say anything to any audience, willing to oppose anything that this government puts forward. They have been willing to oppose so many sensible reforms over the course of this year, including reforms, Deputy Speaker, which they themselves introduced. So we saw the extraordinary situation on fuel taxation earlier this year, in which reforms introduced by then Treasurer Peter Costello were opposed by the Liberal and National parties for the sake of a cheap headline. They decided that it was better to back in economic populism rather than to support economic reform that it was in the long-run interests of Australia. Deputy Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is, I think, pursuing a strategy which has its strongest antecedents in the doomsday cult leader. Doomsday cult leaders are greatly successful for a number of different reasons. The first thing a doomsday cult leader can do is they can offer absolutely everything to their followers. You want free food? I've got it. You want free wine? I've got it. You want free love? I've got it. And you can see that in the opposition's $70 billion black hole in their costings. Deputy Speaker, the opposition have such a big black hole in their costings because they are willing to offer something to everybody but never able to say where the money will come from. If you want to stand before the Australian people as an alternative government, you need to identify where the savings are coming from. But no, the opposition would rather stand up as a doomsday cult and say that you can have anything you want. You won't have to pay for it. We'll give it all to you. And the second similarity, Deputy Speaker, with a doomsday cult is that the opposition are predicting the end of the world. They have, like all good doomsday cult leaders, a particular date in mind. Their date is the 1st of July 2012. On the 1st of July 2012, prices will skyrocket, towns will be wiped off the map, whole industries will be destroyed. We know, of course, Deputy Speaker, that none of these claims are true. We know the price effect will be 0.7% on the CPI, less than a third of the price impact of the GST. We know that generous assistance to trade-exposed, emissions-intensive industries will ensure that jobs are supported. We know that the generous household assistance will ensure that Australians are able to buy the basket of goods that they currently buy. But for those who are running the doomsday cult, it's useful to have a date on which the world will end. That's how you rally the supporters behind you. You need to have a concrete moment on which the world will end, and that date for the opposition is the 1st of July 2012. There's just one small problem, Deputy Speaker, which is that one that is common to all doomsday cults, and that is that your date eventually comes around. There is a day in which you have to look your followers in the eye and you have to say, well, it didn't quite pan out the way we said it would. And so on the 2nd of July 2012, the opposition will be looking their followers in the eye and trying to explain why prices on the shelves and jobs look pretty much the way they did. But I don't think we should predict that the cult will completely fall apart there. And here I'm indebted to some work by Leon Festinger and other sociological researchers in their book When Prophecy Fails, a social and psychological study of a modern group that predicted the destruction of the world. And they note that after the failure of events to come true, that groups sometimes regroup, realising that as a form of coping mechanism called dissonance reduction, a form of rationalisation, members often dedicate themselves with renewed vigour to the group's cause after a failed prophecy. They rationalise with expectations such as the belief that their actions forestalled the disaster. I suspect we will see some of Festinger's predictions after the 1st of July 2012, but that doomsday cult leader strategy will not wash with the Australian people. They will see straight through the Leader of the Opposition.